The thing is, I think they're interesting. We're trying to sort of connect the connections between, on the other hand, the austere, sort of unworldly, secular, saintly figure of Orwell and the much more worldly affaire, certainly in his early days. I mean, Anthony Powell said of Evelyn Waugh that as soon as he achieved any kind of success, he behaved as if he were a duke, or rather, he behaved as if he expected a duke to behave, which is a rather different thing. But talking about these connections, I think we could make a distinction. There is a whole series of, to me, fascinating but kind of ghostly connections between Orwell and that set that you just defined and delimited of the social world of the 1920s that Waugh wrote about in his first two novels, in Decline and Fall, published in 1928, and in Vile Bodies, published in 1930. In fact, later on, Orwell wrote very, very interestingly about Vile Bodies, which is something we perhaps could get onto later. But the curious thing is that, I mean, Eton was a very age-conscious and segregated school society. I'm led to believe. I didn't go there myself. I've simply read about it in other people's descriptions of it. And so Anthony Powell, for example, who was 2 years younger than Orwell, didn't even know him by sight when they were both at Eton together. But I'm convinced that I'm convinced that Orwell knew about Acton and Howard and the activities of the Eton Society of the Arts. And I'm convinced that when he later, in the 1930s, began his diatribes against what he called the pansy aesthetes of the left, the fake socialists, the arty socialist types, and I'm convinced that he was having a go at people like Brian Howard, although I've never been able to trace an actual physical meeting between the two. But
I think also that the rigidity of the class system as well is something that it's almost difficult for us to understand now, because it was so stratified. And I think George Orwell, in that wonderful, I mean, it brings tears to my eyes reading that essay about his first boarding school where he was treated so badly and such with the joys. And it's painful reading. I don't know if some of you will know it. And he describes how miserable this 8-year-old boy sent away, just so miserable. And just the sense that all the time your whole being was bound up in, how much does your pater earn? What car do you drive? Do your servants have servants?
Do you go to Scotland?
Do you go to Scotland? Yes. And he's of course answering no to all these questions, and it just instantly places you. And his whole enterprise, I think, is saying in that school that if you were a poor boy and he was a scholarship boy, the headmaster and headmistress were just not interested in you. They just didn't want to know. And not only that, they would be cruel to you in a way that they wouldn't be for the richer boys. So obviously this shapes Orwell and I think as a Lansing, and I think Orwell was badly bullied. It's interesting that Evelyn became a bully.
Cecil Beaton, wasn't it?
Yeah. Cecil Beaton, famously.
Cecil Beaton,
he said he had these sort of beautiful
and he was thought to enjoy his music lessons. That was the thing, wasn't it?
But he said it was his long curly eyelashes that incited our sadism, and they sort of pinched him and taunted him and were cruel to him. And Evelyn said afterwards, he said, reading back at my diaries, I just can't believe what an absolute odious prig and bully I was. He said, but it really was, if you don't bully, if you don't become a bully, you will be bullied. And it was a sort of sink or swim attitude. And I think that's something that Orwell, I mean, he just, that one time he famously hit back, didn't he? He hit somebody he was being bullied by, and then he realised that he'd stood up for himself, and this was the way to do it. And he said, realising later on, that's what I should have done all along. I should have just defended myself. So I'm quite interested in those sorts of parallels, because they shape you as a writer, as a person. And interestingly, Orwell didn't want to go to Oxford.
Well, he couldn't, if any. I mean, he just didn't work hard enough at Eton, did he? It was just completely beyond him, I think.
But he didn't want to. Yeah, well,
no, he didn't want to follow those particular.
Whereas, as I say, for Evelyn, it was the absolute raison d'être. He wanted to go to Oxford, and that was when, to him, his life completely took off. So.
That's right. No, going back to those I mean, it's obviously literary and indeed political society in those days was a much smaller world, much more tightly, much more sort of had much tighter parameters. But so all through, until even long years before I actually met, there are these interesting kind of non-connections between them. I published a book 2 or 3 years ago about the Bright Young People war social set, which in some cases bleeds into the sort of territory that Paula was writing about in her book Mad World. And the really curious thing is how the links sort of stray across, in that there was a famous bright young woman called Inez Holden, who great friend of Evelyn Waugh in the 1920s, friend of Anthony Pole's, and then a great friend of Orwell's 10 years later, when the two of them actually were trying to get a joint publishing project of publishing their war diaries, and Inez Holden's was actually published. And Galland's turned down Orwell's on the ground that it would offend too many prominent people. So that was the end of the project. Similarly, I mean, again, just to give you an idea of how closed this little world was, there was a famous bright young person's party. In fact, the climax of the whole era in 1931, which was the Red and White Party, a famously decadent occasion, that was actually denounced by the society newspapers because it coincided with a march of unemployed workers on London, and this was thought to describe as the kind of behaviour that that starts Bolshevism off. And Bernadine Paul, the society drug addict, was taken off by the police having assaulted a young woman called Sunday Wilshin, curious name. She then later worked with Orwell at the BBC. So all the way through there are these sort of, the lines stray into each other. And then come the late 1940s, Orwell is a close friend of his two particular friends of the last year or so he lived in London in 1947-48, were Malcolm Muggeridge and Anthony Pole, who were both, of course, friends of Waugh's. And then it all begins to connect up. And the thing about this is that some students of Orwell and the late 1940s political scene would look at those connections, would look at the figures of Orwell, Muggeridge, Pole, Waugh all together, and just defy anybody to connect them up. And in fact, I've no wish at all to introduce the memory of the late Professor Sir Bernard Crick, who wrote the pioneering Orwell biography, to which I doff my hat, and my own book couldn't have been written without him. But Crick once went to interview Anthony Pole about his relationship with Orwell, and Pole reproduces the encounter in his memoirs. And Crick, frankly, sat there and said to him that he could not understand how Orwell had been his friend. To which, Pole just lofted it out, well, this is just routine with these people. And you see, I would argue that there was much more to draw writers, indeed, human beings like Orwell, Waugh, Muggeridge and Pole together than there was to draw them apart. For a start, each of them, I would have said, had an intensely conservative view of the world. I mean, that may sound an odd thing to say about Orwell, but as somebody famously remarked, Orwell, in everything but politics, was deeply conservative. It was simply, it's just simply the fact that everything else, his entire outlook was grounded in the illusions of 1910. It was part of him. He was an Edwardian gentleman who just happened to be a radical socialist. And what do you think about that?
Well, I do, and just as you were talking, it was making me think about the positions they took during the war, and I think in the Second World War, and I think that's so interesting because they were both obviously opposed to totalitarianism, but also what they both really despised was the sort of the middle class intellectual. He calls modern intellectuals who took this position that you either made a choice between fascism or communism, whereas both Waugh and Orwell, you don't actually have to make a choice in doing that. And I think one of the ways that they do become quite ways where they become very similar is they say they both, or certainly for Waugh, believe that if you abolish the upper classes, there will still be a class system. You're never going to get rid of the class system, and all you will get is the modern intellectuals will become the new class, and that will be disastrous because they won't have all the values and the tradition, and certainly for Orwell, and for Waugh, not for Orwell, for him, religion was the absolutely underpinning thing. And I think that again draws them together, I think.